Today on Family Talk.
Any experienced parent would tell you that raising children is no picnic. You can have great fun with them one minute and be driven crazy by them the next. In those moments of intense frustration, things can be said or done that parents might immediately regret. The guilt of those instances can haunt a parent for many years as they feel like they can never be the perfect parent. Welcome, everyone, to Family Talk with your host, world-renowned child psychologist and best-selling author, Dr. James Dobson. I'm Roger Marsh, and on this broadcast, we will talk about the perceived blame moms and dads feel in regards to bad parenting decisions. We'll be talking with Julie Barnhill, an international speaker, author of 11 books, and former columnist with articles featured in the Wall Street Journal and Lifeway magazine. Today, Julie will tell her own story of feeling guilty in the mistakes that she made in parenting her 3 children. But she shares how she got past that self-blame and encourages other moms to do the same. A lot of what Dr. Dobson and Julie will be talking about today is geared more toward mothers, but the principles are also applicable to fathers as well. Here now is the first part of their conversation that we've titled Confronting Guilt in Motherhood on this edition of Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk.
Julie, guilt and motherhood just go hand in glove, don't they?
They really do. And, it just follows up to once you deal with that anger as a mother and you deal with some of those issues, what's left a lot of times, the guilt of what went on.
You wrote in the book that guilt in mothers is second only to anger as a source of angst.
Absolutely. Yeah. This weight that dominates our lives oftentimes as mothers, from the time they're, even before conception. Dr. Dobson, I remember reading an article about folic acid and how important that was, and I could not swallow those, like the size of a man's big toe. I mean, you just can't swallow those things.
Not quite.
No. But I could not get those things down. And, I just thought, I went for a sonogram and I was so concerned that her development was moving the way it should because I thought I didn't take those pills. And she was the size of a lima bean and I already had guilt. So it's definitely something that we pick up as moms.
Now, you are not just giving your opinion about this, but you surveyed 850 women about this subject.
Absolutely.
What did you hear?
Well, it was probably even more than that. I spoke for about 18 months, and everywhere I spoke, and I'd speak to audiences as large as about 6,000 at one time, and every one of them would get a piece of paper, and I'd say, take this back to your room and bring it back when you've had a little time to think about it. And I ask, what are the things you did right? What are the things that you regret? And, just all sorts of questions, and gathered all that information and tabulated it. And I finds out, from age 20 moms to age, I think the oldest woman that responded was 87 years old, have guilt. 87 years old, and I thought.
Still felt this sense of failure.
Her son was 56 years old and felt guilty about something that happened when he was 3 years old. And I thought, my word, how long do you have to pick that up and carry it? And I really wanted to write a book about guilt with humor, practicality, realness, authenticity, and let you know you're not alone.
Men feel guilt too, but a different kind and over different issues. What makes women so vulnerable to feelings of guilt?
I think part of it's just our chromosome makeup, and I'll say this, and you can disagree with me if you want, but I said, when's the last time Promise Keepers had a conference, and one of the workshops was on, dads with guilt. And, and you have your guilt in your area, but we seem to carry the relational load of that in the family. So I think part of it's our chromosome, part of it's just how we react to one another as women, as mothers, your daughter-in-law is going to come across this. With Lincoln, it's going to be, is Lincoln potty trained yet? Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Well, little Junior was potty trained,
You're really kind of late, aren't you? My
exactly.
goodness. What have you done about that?
Exactly. So I feel guilty. I should have potty trained, and they shouldn't have the pacifier, and it should be, nuked in the microwave so it's sterile. And so I think part of it's us.
The best answer to that? The best answer is that, have you ever seen an adult who wasn't potty trained?
Exactly.
Eventually it's going to happen. Don't get excited about it.
But boy, with that first one, it's hard to let go of that. And so I think, part of it is our chromosome, our culture, of course, the pressure to do it all and do it all well and effectively. And that's within our Christian culture, Dr. Dobson, And
if it really is in the feminine nature to be vulnerable to guilt, then it's not just a cultural thing. It's not just in the West. It's probably all around the world.
Right. And good point. And I think part of the relational is that part of our nature is to fix things. I think, that we want those relationships tight. And then I think part of it is just how we are with women and with other moms. And we're not very gracious sometimes, and we're definitely not very gracious with ourselves, have lots of expectations.
Was your choice of this topic to speak and write about introspective? I mean, you want to give us a little honesty here?
Oh.
Are you dealing with or have you dealt with your own guilt? And if so, over what?
Oh, you want all the details.
I want it, yes.
You know what? I said this in the book. In fact, I have a chapter, just what I felt, my guilt list. Yeah. And I said, if you're anything like me, that's the first chapter. You skipped the prologue and all that, and you went right to this. Yeah. Because if I was a listener right now, I'd want to know one of three things. First, does this woman have children? Uh-huh. The second is, what's her relationship like now with her children? Mm-hmm. Have they all taken off and don't have anything to do with her? And the third one is that, did you struggle with it? And don't give me a bunch of elusive, well, I felt kind of guilty about, so I'll give you some of my guilt list. Mm-hmm. All right. And it's from the sublime to the really serious. I took money from my children. They get birthday money, and we'd be short in cash around the house.
You did.
I did. And well, Kristen, the firstborn, got wise about age 7. And started putting her money in a Ziploc bag and hiding it around the house. So I felt guilty about that. I had Ricky Neal, the second one, 18 months after we had Kristen. So of course I had guilt there with, I didn't spend as much time with him. I was much quicker to give him a bottle and prop it. I know you're not supposed to do that, but I did it, so I could get a little rest. And so I've had a lot of guilt, for my anger.
And when she feels guilty, she blows.
Absolutely.
Those
it's a vicious
very
cycle.
Much related, aren't they?
Very much so. Very much so. So one of the things I like to do, and and we could do this maybe perhaps right now for listeners, is I like for moms to say what they've done right. And that's actually how the book opens, is, what I've done right. And here's what's funny. If I ask some of these moms, what are 3 things that you absolutely don't feel guilty about as a mom? They would look at me like I just nominated their kid for the ugly baby contest, of the year. But if I said, what are 3 things you feel guilty about? 1, 2, 3. Absolutely. So it's imperative because it's truth, because we've done innumerable things right. And we lose that in the midst of the guilt. So what are 3 things? 1 thing. Start with 1. And it can be as simple as, I didn't feed my kids ketchup and tomatoes last night or something. I gave them food. That was good. I did that right. I said, I love you 1,000,000 times yesterday. Whatever those things are, moms need to speak that to themselves.
How about,
it's true.
I poured my heart and soul into my children.
Absolutely.
I was not perfect. I didn't always do it right. I wish I could go back and do it again in many ways, but I can't change one single day. And I gave it the best shot I had, and I asked the Lord to help me, and somehow He helped me overcome and help them overcome my own shortcomings.
Absolutely.
I tell you, you cannot do the job perfectly.
No.
You can no more be a perfect parent than you can be a perfect human being.
Well, I liken it to, and I liken this guilt, because I think we do well with pictures, like a word picture. So I liken this guilt to, you've got the little mountain range here in Colorado Springs, and instead of the Colorado Rockies, it would be Giltmore National Park, this national mountain park. And instead of, Pikes Peak and some of these other peaks, you have Mount Shoulda and Mount Woulda, Mount Coulda, Mount Inconsistency, and
Mount Unimaginable. Let's work our way through those.
Yes. Okay.
The first one is Mount Shoulda. Mm-hmm. Explain that.
Well, all the things we should have done before, during, and after mothering. And I mean, this can go, the tentacles go everywhere. You have a child and it brings your relationship with your husband under a microscope. And you think, I should have thought about some of these things about this man, and I should have really considered the in-laws a little bit more. Just kidding. But, we go all these places. So it's the shouldas of our mothering. I should have, what a huge one is, Dr. Dobson? I should have prayed more.
Yeah.
Because I speak a lot, 50-50 to Christian and secular events. But in those Christian events, when I speak about guilt, that is priority 1. And my question has been, gosh, is there a magic number? Is there a magic number that I should have prayed, 1,006 times, and that would have taken care of?
And does the Lord have a timer there?
Exactly.
Where he's saying, sorry.
Right, you missed it.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what a weight that is. You and I were talking a little bit before the show that, it really is about freedom. It really is about truth. And only God, only the Holy Spirit can really reveal that truth that changes our hearts and our minds and how we think about guilt. And that is priority one.
Julie, we hear a lot these days about the homeschools movement. And I think a lot of women feel guilty because they haven't been willing to do that. And it was never intended, certainly our broadcast has never been intended to make anybody feel guilty if they, could not in their circumstances go in that direction. And yet I think a lot of women feel, I should have.
Boy, you hit a big one. We homeschooled for 3.5 years, and Kristen and Ricky would have been about 2nd grade through 6th grade. And I had lots of guilt when I homeschooled because even within the homeschooling, it's kind of like they need to excel. Yeah. It's not enough just to be ordinary at this level. Because I'm doing this full time, I need to excel at that. It goes back kind of what I mentioned before about that power we have as women to really alleviate a lot of the guilt that one another carries. A lot of moms get in discussions and talk about these things. And and if this isn't the time for you to homeschool, or you choose not to for whatever the circumstances, God is bigger than all of that. Yeah. And we can trust in that, which is something we talk about.
Related to the homeschool situation is the guilt that many women feel over working outside the home, being formally employed. I should have stayed home. Interestingly, some of those that stay home say, I should have helped with the finances. You can't win. I mean, it's a situation where everybody looks at themselves and says, I'm inadequate.
And it's such a vicious cycle. And the 87-year-old woman I mentioned, that's what her guilt was. She said that when her son was 3, and that would have been, help me with the math, when that would have been, but she had to go to work. And that was definitely a time period when women didn't work. And she said, I wish we'd had the money I could have stayed home with him.
We're talking to Julie Barnhill, who has written Motherhood, the Guilt That Keeps on Giving, talking about the pervasiveness of guilt and the difficulty of dealing with it. And some women are far more vulnerable to it than others. In fact, Julie, you said something in this book that really rings true, having to do with low self-esteem and a sense of inadequacy. The more you tend to doubt yourself as a person, the more you feel if they really knew me, they wouldn't like me anyway. Right. And that is so common. I wrote a book called What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Women, and the number one source of depression was low self-esteem, this feeling that I'm inadequate. Well, the more you feel like that, the more vulnerable you are to those little voices that whisper in your ear and say, you messed it up, didn't you?
Exactly.
You're really not good enough.
It just spirals deeper and deeper. What you're mentioning and talking about is really defining that guilt. And I just go to Webster's for definitions, and one of them is a violation of a law. I go speeding through town here, 65 and a 35, I get a ticket, I'm guilty. And then the other definition is where I think the majority of us women fall as moms, and that is, it's those feelings of culpability or a sense of inadequacy. And, that you can't, that's like nailing Jell-O to a wall. I mean, there's nothing specific about that when it comes to guilt. It's just, vague and cloudy, but I just feel this way.
Yeah. Well, you, along that same line, you talk in the book about true guilt versus false guilt. Lay that out for us.
Well, I like short and simple. I'm a short and simple girl. And Mary Welchel, actually, I read this in a book that she had written, and I thought that absolutely nails it. True guilt is specific. It's specific. You know what you did wrong. And you may have to think about this a little bit. I call it taking back your brain. So you may have to ask some questions and examine some things. But when it comes down to it, you know what you did wrong. And if you ask yourself, how do I fix this, or what do I need to do to to change this, you know what to do. False guilt is, again, that elusive, vague, cloudy, really feeling rather than a fact. And we really have to examine that and look at that. And I think if we'll take the time, and this is why in conferences I will tell women one guilt that you have, because we want to list all of them, but you pick the one guilt that you have. And let's just ask this question. Do you know what you did wrong? Do you know why you feel guilty about this? If the answer is yes, write that down. Do you know what you need to do in order to change this, to fix this? You write that down. True guilt. The enemy of our soul, the enemy of our family, loves to make his bed in generalities. And I have found that the Holy Spirit is very specific. It's not a carrot. He doesn't put a carrot in front of you and snatch it away. You know exactly what you need to deal with. And we can trust that.
We have been talking here about guilt with children exclusively. But we feel guilty about everything, right? Especially guilt before God. Exactly. And there is true guilt and there's false guilt before Him too. Some people feel like they have to earn their salvation every day. If they're not out on a street corner someplace preaching and passing out tracts, they somehow feel they have not been worthy of this Christ who died for us. And in fact, He came not because of what we do, but because of His love for us. So there are other kinds of guilt.
Absolutely, and that's good guilt, and that's the thing with this motherhood guilt. I mean, we don't wipe guilt completely away, and this is why I say, it's not like we get rid of guilt. That's not the purpose of this program. That after listening to it, you never have guilt again, because some guilt is necessary for your development with the Father, with God the Father, and also within your relationship, because you mess up. But it's going to be specific. And I think another word that comes to me, Dr. Dobson, is just this whole thing of grace, this scandalous grace. And it's just an affront to religion, and all the do's and don'ts, that here's a God that says, I know you mess up. I knew you were going to mess up before I ever created you. Yeah. And that's why you need me.
Now, here's where it really gets difficult, because some guilt is valid. Some guilt is a motivator and should be. Some guilt means the Lord is saying, you've got to do better about that. And some guilt comes from doing a really, really sloppy job with children and causing them harm. And the issue is how we're going to deal with it in a situation like that. You said a minute ago that some guilt is good. I think of Peter after denying Christ the night before Christ was put on the cross, and he denied Him 3 times. His one of his closest disciples and associates. And what did he do? He turned his back on Christ and went out and wept bitterly. That is repentance.
Yes.
That was good that
Absolutely.
He did that. He knew that he was wrong, and he admitted it before God and wept bitterly. So the situation is knowing which guilt is valid and dealing with it and getting forgiveness for it and getting beyond it, as opposed to this guilt that is just nagging at you and there's nothing you can do to get rid of it.
Well, that's a truthful principle for all parents to remember indeed, and it is important to distinguish between the nudging of the Holy Spirit and the nagging of the devil. You're listening to Family Talk, and a great conversation Dr. James Dobson had with author and speaker Julie Barnhill. Now, before we return to today's broadcast, I'd like to remind you that Family Talk is a listener-supported ministry. We survive on your tax-deductible financial contributions. So if you're able to donate to Family Talk, remember you can call us toll-free at 877-732-6825. You can also make a donation online through our secure website at drjamesdobson.org. We are extremely grateful for your prayers and thankful for your financial generosity. Okay, now let's rejoin today's lively broadcast right now. We'll pick it up with Dr. James Dobson and author Julie Barnhill discussing the role that husbands have in helping their wives process real guilt and false guilt.
Well, I'm thinking about my relationship with my husband and all of this, and one of the things I've learned, we're going on 20 years, and I'm finally learning to listen to him a little bit. And it's been tough for me. And there's probably some women out there like me who, I used to always say, I can't help it that I'm usually right, just the way it works. But, I've kind of learned the hard way I need to listen to him. And there are some times when Rick does say to me, Julie, get over it. And, I've needed to hear that. I mean, there has been some guilt that it wasn't true guilt. Or maybe it was true and I acknowledged it, I confessed it, I asked forgiveness, and I tried to was making amends. And he's like, all right, move on, sweetheart. And I needed to hear that, needed someone to tell me to move on. And another part of it is just, I don't know, you let us work it out. Let us talk it out with you. And I know that's very painful. My husband and I drove 7.5 hours to an event in Minneapolis. It was Downpour, James McDonald, and really a revival, called a revival. 7.5 hours there and 7.5 hours back. And at one point, I kind of looked at him, and he had this kind of glazed look in his eye. I'm like, are you tired of talking? He's like, no, not really. But, just to listen to us, to alleviate some of those guilt. Some of those guilts can be alleviated by you stepping in, spending some time with the kids or helping out, in the household chores. And your words of saying, you know what, I don't expect you to do this and that, because part of this, Dr. Dobson, is that I call it Mount Immaculate Perfection, this peak that we think we can do it all right. And it's a lie, and it's killing us in our souls and in our homes.
So the middle ground is examine the guilt that's there, decide if it's valid, and if it's valid, you take it to the Lord and ask for His forgiveness, and maybe talk it out with those who love you, those closest to you, and then put it aside.
That's right.
Because you can't change it.
Hey, you should write a book.
I did.
You're good at that.
It's called Emotions. Can you trust them? But it's not.
You nailed it. I mean, and that's it. And that's the difficult part, is just dropping it and moving on.
Yeah.
Because we kind of want to circle back to that, those little voices that whisper to us at times.
Well, we want to do another program with you, Julie, and we'll start at that point, because the question is how. We're talking to an awful lot of women especially, but women and men, who are plagued by guilt. It's there. They can't get away from it. It's almost compulsive in their response to it. But they don't have a clue as to how to deal with it. It's not enough to just say, I'm not going to feel guilty about that anymore.
Right.
That doesn't work. And you have offered some suggestions in this book for how to do that. The title of the book is Motherhood, the Guilt That Keeps on Giving. It's a funny woman sitting here at the top of Mount Guiltmore. And the book, again, is very, very practical. It deals with the kind of things that I think every mother who's sensitive at all is going to have experienced. Now, Julie, there is one little problem in this book, and I don't mean to embarrass you, but you make reference to Austin Powers in here a couple of times, and that was a wretched movie.
Yes, it was.
And you raised that and said something about it being funny. That's the only thing in the book that I found that makes me uncomfortable with it. So let's just go ahead and make the book available. Everything else is great. Just don't read that paragraph.
Well,
okay?
Can I explain
sure,
myself?
Sure, you can. Yes.
All right. Well, it's actually in my guilt list. What I feel guilty for, and the first guilt is that I feel guilty because my children can quote portions of the Austin Power movie, and then my second guilt after that is I feel guilty because I've laughed at that. And it's kind of interesting. I was talking to the producer about this, and I said, this is perfect, and I'm glad you brought it up, because hence another guilt. We try to keep all that crud at bay.
Yeah.
We do our best to put up our borders and our parameters and all that, and yet it seems to insidiously find its way into
Comes
our
in
heart
under
and
the
home.
door.
And I'm like, do you not understand that I'm going on Dr. Dobson's show? You can't be quoting Austin Powers. But, and I hope it gives hope to other moms, because we do. You have this ideal and how you want it to be and the stuff that you do allow into your homes.
Did I just make you feel guilty?
No, you did not.
Okay. Well, it is a good book, Julie. You've done a great job, and I hope a lot of our listeners will write for a copy. We'll pick up right here next time.
As always, it's a pleasure.
Well, this has certainly been an open and honest discussion on the challenges of parenting and overcoming guilt on this edition of Dr. James Dobson's Family Talk. Learn more about Julie Barnhill's ministry or her many books by visiting today's broadcast page at drjamesdobson.org. Now, keep in mind that Dr. Dobson and Julie mentioned numerous times about her book, Motherhood, The Guilt That Keeps on Giving. That book is still available, but has recently been retitled Confessions of an Imperfect Mom. So learn how you can get that updated edition at drjamesdobson.org when you click onto the broadcast page. I'm Roger Marsh. Thanks so much for joining us today. Be sure to join us again tomorrow to hear part 2 of Dr. James Dobson's conversation with Julie Barnhill right here on Family Talk. Have a blessed day.
Family Talk is not associated with Focus on the Family.